Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
On Friday, we saw a really contentious meeting in the White House between President Donald Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And you have some numbers on it, what Americans think about it, but I'll recap what just happened. So the three leaders were sitting in the meeting, taking questions from press, and at about the 40-minute mark, Vice President J.D. Vance wanted to respond to a question on diplomacy with Russia. He complimented President Trump's approach versus President Biden's approach, and that's when Ukrainian President Zelensky jumped in. He responded to Vice President Vance by saying this: "What kind of diplomacy, J.D., are you speaking about?" And then he essentially explained how Russia has been a bad faith actor in negotiations with Ukraine for the past decade. And then from there, it really devolved into 10 minutes of chaos, with President Trump eventually jumping in. So what do Americans think about what happened in this White House meeting?
Yeah, and I think Americans, generally paid attention. They heard about this through the media over the weekend, and so we decided to get into the field on Sunday to test this out. And overall, folks think that neither party walked away as the sort of winner of the meeting. So 46% say that neither the U.S. nor Ukraine walked away as a winner from that meeting. 35% said that the U.S. won, 15% Ukraine, and 4% for both. So, as you might expect, that sort of breaks down along party lines. Majorities of Democrats and independents say that neither party won, while a majority of Republicans say that the U.S. really won that exchange based on the conversation with President Trump and J.D. Vance. So, I think the major takeaway here is that this was not necessarily a winning meeting, a productive meeting, maybe, but not necessarily. Neither party necessarily gained or lost anything from this meeting.
This meeting was one of those moments where I was getting texts, even from people who don't really are tuned into the news, look at politics too much, saying, "Hey, what's happening? Explain this." So it seems like the 11-minute argument really touched Americans across the aisle. So when you're looking at people, Democrats and Republicans, did they see what happened very differently?
And yeah, I think that they did. As I said, Democrats and independents agree that neither party won this exchange. Republicans, on the other hand, feel that the U.S. was really the clear winner of this exchange. If we look at the handling of the war overall, how Trump has handled the war, we see that it's a little bit of a mixed bag. 41% say that he's handled it excellent or good. 44% say less good. 73% of Republicans do approve of the handling of the war. 76% of Democrats disapprove. And then independents overall disapprove 46% to 35%. So, these are very much partisan lens, but I think that the major takeaway from the meeting is that, this was not a winning meeting for either party here.
President Trump really got angry at the point when Ukrainian President Zelensky said to him, "There's an ocean separating Europe and Russia from the United States, from America, but you will eventually feel this." And President Trump responded, "Don't tell us how to feel," got really angry from there. And after this meeting, he kicked Zelensky out of the White House. They were supposed to sign the minerals deal. That didn't happen. And when you're looking at reaction from this over the past few days, people have been saying everything from President Trump was a hothead, he did not handle this correctly, he was spouting Kremlin talking points, to, hey, this is the art of the deal, he's being tough with Ukraine. Overall, we've talked about, since President Trump took office, his approval rating at points at the beginning, you called it historic. Now, 6 weeks in, did this change his approval at all?
And I don't think that we are necessarily seeing the full effects on his approval rating, because it's pretty similar to what we saw in January. So here we see 48% approve, 43% disapprove. So he's still at a net +5 approval, but it is a 1-point net decrease since January. We look at independents here. It's 39% approve versus 46% disapprove. So I do think that we're seeing a gradual erosion, from his high once he took office earlier in January. So I think that there's a trend line here. I don't know how far it will go. I think notably our poll shows his approval rating higher than some of the other polls out there. And if you look at the aggregate, he's somewhere around even, whereas we have him at about +5 approval. So I think that speaks to the rest of the poll here when we look at some of the things like foreign policy, where folks aren't necessarily on board with President Trump's approach, yet they still approve of him overall. He still has a reasonably favorable public image. So I think that does reinforce some of these other findings in the poll.
Let's talk about what voters think about his foreign policy, because on the campaign trail, President Trump said he could end this war between Ukraine and Russia in a day. Obviously, that didn't happen. When we saw President Biden as president, he said to Ukraine publicly, "We are always with you." President Trump just paused spending and aid on Ukraine. So what do people think about President Trump's foreign policy?
So the rating of his foreign policy overall is 56% say that it is poor or fair. 44% say that it's excellent or good. Once again, this breaks down under a partisan lens. 76% of Republicans rated excellent or good. 83% of Democrats and 64% of independents say that it's just fair or poor. When you look at Ukraine specifically and how the U.S. has given aid to Ukraine, 45% say that we've given too much aid to Ukraine. 33% say about the right amount. 22% say too little. Now, depending on the numbers that you're looking at, that too much figure, that's much higher than it was 2 years ago. It's higher than it was a year ago. I think no matter how you split it, there are a significant number of folks who are moving over that side of, we've given too much to Ukraine. But it's still a minority. There's still a majority who say it's about right or it's not enough. So I think that there are different approaches here. There are different ways to look at this. I think that overall folks are mostly on board with trying to end this war, with ending maybe additional spending on behalf of the U.S. Any sort of really sizable package like we saw with the Biden administration. But I don't interpret this as that the U.S. should capitulate or that it should end aid in whatever means altogether.
To your point there, Democrats and some Republicans I've talked to have said we need to continue aid to Ukraine because if not, Russia could steamroll Ukraine. That could start a World War III. More conservative Republicans I've talked to have said we need to put America first. We can't fund these wars. President Trump himself campaigned on putting America first. Do people think that that's what he's doing?
Yeah, this one was interesting. We tested just to see if folks think that the Trump administration is putting America first. 48% say yes, and 41% say no. Again, those are very much sort of partisan lines that are drawn. Independents are split here. 45% say yes, 44% say no. But I think that this is an interesting one. There's a little bit more consensus that the Trump administration is putting America first. I think that if you watch that meeting, depending on how you read this question, a Democrat might reasonably say, yeah, he is putting America first. They don't necessarily agree with that, but I think that there is a little bit more here that say, yeah, he's doing what he said he would do.
This inflection point of the United States' relationship with Ukraine came the week as we marked the third anniversary of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And there is a lot that remains to be seen with the country. What do people think is going to happen in Ukraine's future?
Yeah, and overall, folks recognize that Ukraine will probably have to go to the negotiating table and will probably have to give up some amount of territory. But a majority say that Ukraine will have to give up some territory, but will remain an independent country, autonomous from any other. Just 17% say that Ukraine will become a part of Russia. I think that would probably require a sizable realignment in Russia to overtake the Ukrainian forces and for all aid to be pulled back, both American and European. So I don't think that folks see that as a likely outcome, rather. And folks also don't see it terribly likely that Ukraine is going to be able to preserve its territory that it held prior to the Russian invasion.
In that really contentious exchange between Trump and Zelensky in the White House on Friday, President Trump said to Zelensky, "You're overplaying your hand here. You're gambling with World War III." Emerson College polling asked Americans, do people see World War III as a real possibility? What are the results there?
Yeah, we found that 55% say that it's either very or somewhat likely that we will end up in another world war within the next 4 years. 45% said it's either somewhat or very unlikely. And if you look at those numbers by demographic, you see that scales almost perfectly with age. Younger folks think that it's more likely that we're going to end up in a world war within the next 4 years. Older folks think that that's much less likely. So there is split here. I don't know how much more we can say other than, there's certainly more concern among this younger generation who haven't lived through a world war. But then again, a lot of these folks who are in their 50s, in their 40s, they also haven't. So, but I think that we can reasonably say that tensions are high here.
I do want to zoom out just a little bit because as tensions are high right now, to say the least, some Republican lawmakers, Elon Musk himself, have said and floated the possibility of the United States withdrawing from NATO. We've been part of NATO since its founding in 1949. Do Americans want to see the United States withdraw from NATO?
They do not. 48% oppose withdrawing from NATO. Just 28% support it. And then 25% are neutral or unsure. So yes, that plurality that oppose, that is technically a minority when you consider that 52% don't outright support leaving NATO. But I'd caution here, that's a really high number, 48% who say that they outright oppose leaving NATO. That makes for bad policy if the Trump administration were to pursue leaving the organization. Again, this is a little bit partisan, so 66% of Democrats, 50% of independents oppose leaving NATO. 27% of Republicans also oppose, but 47% support. So there is something to be said for Trump playing to his base there. Again, that is a high number, but in the grand scheme of things, that 47% of Republicans, that is a minority in the country who actually support withdrawing from the organization. I think, if Republicans did pursue this policy, then the 2026 midterms could be that much more difficult.
I want to zoom out even further here. The poll asked about some world leaders and what the sentiment is behind them, including people involved in this directly, Trump, Zelensky, and Putin, as well as China's Xi Jinping, France's Emmanuel Macron, and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer. What do Americans think about these heads of nations?
Yeah, so we asked favorability on all of these folks. So starting with Trump, he's at 46% favorable versus 45% unfavorable. I think that tracks with his approval numbers. I think there's also something to be said for some folks out there who, approve of what he does as president, voted for him as president, but don't necessarily like him personally. So a few things that might turn them off from him. But overall, that's still a reasonably high rating. It is certainly divided but a reasonably high rating for President Trump. We look at Zelensky. I think that he is among the top on this list. So 45% have a favorable rating, 28% have an unfavorable rating. Looking at those numbers a little closer, it's lowest among Republicans, as you might expect, 38% favorable versus 46% unfavorable. It is highest among Democrats, 66% favorable versus 10% unfavorable. And then independents overall have a favorable opinion, 43% to 27%. Next, let's look at Putin. So very highly unpopular, the least popular on this list at 12% favorable versus 69% unfavorable. So that's a net minus 57 favorability rating for Vladimir Putin. It is highest among Republicans, but it's still very low at 14%, 62% unfavorable. Next, the next least popular is Xi, 8% favorable versus 60% unfavorable. Majorities of all parties agree here. Plurality of Republicans say very unfavorable, 48%. And then looking at the European leaders, Macron is at 35% favorable, 18% unfavorable, and Keir Starmer at 35% favorable, 17% unfavorable. So, I think we do see a bit of a trend there. These European leaders, not necessarily quite as well known as some of the others. Putin, certainly very well known, but very much disliked. Same goes for Xi. And Zelensky, I think, is a bit of a clear winner here, both with high name recognition. Folks know who he is at this point, and overall, a very positive image.
Foreign policy has really been in the forefront over the past week or so, but I am curious because you and I have talked about it all the time. Is this a top issue facing voters, or are they more of the same? The economy, immigration, border security, what do those issues look like?
So foreign policy ranks further down the list. It is in the 1% to 5% range as far as folks who say that that's their top concern. However, threats to democracy ranks second with 18%. That's a pretty high number. We saw it approaching that number a little bit during the election, in the lead up to the final weeks of the election, and even on election night during some of the exit polling. But I'm interpreting this a different way now. I think that this increase in threats to democracy, this 18% here, I think there are a significant number of folks in there who interpret this as threats to democracy internationally, and specifically Ukraine. Following this meeting, I think that some folks are likely either alarmed or perhaps even hopeful. But at any rate, I think that they do see that, and that is they are interpreting that as a threat to democracy in Ukraine, and that's now showing up. Of course, the economy remains the top issue, 41%. Immigration has ticked a little bit lower now at 13%, and then rounding out the sort of top four, healthcare at 8%. So not much change otherwise, but I do think that we might not see it reflected in that foreign policy number, but that threats to democracy number, that does seem to be calling towards Ukraine.
The 119th Congress just officially kicked off a couple of months ago, but you have your sights already set on the 2026 midterms, if you can believe it. Who has the advantage on the congressional ballot, Democrats or Republicans?
Yeah, and I think this is worth underscoring here because right now we have Democrats ahead by 3 points on the generic congressional ballot test. We have not seen it that high in quite some time. Our final polling in 2024, we saw Democrats with a +1 advantage over Republicans. So this +3 rating, if it holds, that could be really, really difficult for Republicans heading into 2026. Again, I want to call out that Trump approval number. He's at +5 in this. So he is above water, and yet congressional Republicans, some of them are going to have to really do some campaigning here, it looks like, and they're going to have to look out for their interests in some of these toss-up seats if this holds into the next year. But we'll be testing it. We'll see. I think we do need to see a few more results here to really build a trend line. But if that holds, then that could be really, really tough for congressional Republicans.
That's a really interesting data point because usually if you see a strong top of the ticket, that trickles down and it helps down ballot votes. Why do you think there's a disparity between Donald Trump doing well opposed to some other congressional Republicans?
So I think that it's a combination of factors. So we talked about this previously, that Trump advantage doesn't necessarily translate to success for Republicans further down the ballot. If we just look at the Senate races in 2024, Republicans did not win in the swing states by and large, apart from one instance. But the top of the ticket now, when it is Donald Trump, that does not necessarily mean that Republicans further down the ballot are going to benefit. I think also that we are seeing that approval number slide some, and that the negative connotations with the Trump administration might be amplified in the down ballot testing. I think as we get closer to the election, we're also going to see the effects of turnout. We'll look back to elections like in 2018 when Democrats had a wave that year. That might be the case this year or this next year. Who knows? We'll have to see the further actions of the Trump administration, how Congress deals with the Trump administration. But it's always a tough year for the party in Congress when they share the party of the presidency. So I expect that will likely hold going into 2026. And depending on how the Trump administration deals with these challenges, deals with the economy, with tariffs, and right now a falling stock market, that could translate to some difficult Republican races in 2026.
Well, there's certainly a lot that remains to be seen as we look at Trump's approval over the next 4 years. And I appreciate your data points now, and I'm looking forward to many conversations in the future. Matt Taglia, thank you so much.
I look forward to it too. Thanks so much, Brittany.